Welcome to Crime on Caffeine. I'm your host, Erica.
And I'm your host, Allison. Thank you so much for tuning into another episode. Damn, I really hit him with that one.
Ooh, that musical theater.
Right?
Went through.
Broadway.
Except we were just talking today about how we can't sing anymore.
Guys, I was trying to perform the other day in front of the mirror, just getting it on my own. And I don't know what happened to me that day. It just wasn't it. I lost all vocal range.
I'm not sure where it went, but it's not here anymore.
It's not here. On a good day, though, catch me. Today, we'll be sipping on something a little crazy.
Crazy indeed, because it's Crazy Cups flavored coffee.
I know. Okay, so Erica really likes flavored coffees. I do not, but I gave it a shot. I'm drinking the spiced chai cyclone. Why is it called that?
That's crazy.
It's Crazy Cup.
No, I'm obsessed with this coffee. Okay, if you guys like flavored coffee like me, so I'm having the better than hazelnut because hazelnut is like my favorite flavor ever. But the flavors, guys, I really want to order just like a variety pack because, oh my gosh, the flavors are insane. They have like peanut butter and jelly. They have white chocolate strawberry. They have vanilla pumpkin spice, cinnamon churro, bananas foster, frosted oatmeal cookie, chocolate peanut butter cup, chocolate glazed donut, peppermint chocolate mocha. Like they have so many flavors. Crazy Cups, if you're listening and you happen to have like a spare variety pack sitting in the back that you want to send our way, we would really appreciate it and we would hype you guys up and try every flavor, one flavor per episode. That gives you like 50 episode slots right there of advertising.
Oh my God.
Think about it.
Think about it. Think about it.
The last thing I need right now is this caffeine, but
I know you are hype.
I know, I'm so hyped. So yeah, here we are.
Well, we did have somebody buy us some coffee.
Oh, yes, we did. Huge shout out to Haley for the coffees. We love you. We really appreciate it. That was so sweet of you to send us some coffees. These next crazy cups that we get are on you, Haley. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much. And for those of you who don't know what the heck we're talking about, if you just go on buymeacoffee.com/crimeoncaffeine, you can buy us a coffee.
You can also just go straight to our website, crimeoncaffeine.com, and it'll just pop up right away. Make it real easy for you.
Making it real easy.
Yep, it's right there in your face.
What is happening today?
Okay, well, since I think we've pretty much covered everything.
Give me the case. Give me the case.
This case. So this case is going to involve three main people in this case, all surrounding a kidnapping. And this kidnapping I'd known about, and I'd known about the tragic ending many years later that comes after a happy ending. That's just always drawn me to this case just because of how crazy it is, just very different from any other case. Just the ripple effect of this case, I've never seen anything like it. But we're going to get into that right now.
Okay, because I'm freaking out.
So we're going to talk about Stephen Stayner. We're going to talk about what happens with him. We're going to talk about his family. This might not be known to many of you, which is probably why I did it. Allison, I don't know if you know anything about this case.
I don't know it.
All right. I mean, let's just get on with it. It's wild. It's like every other case I decided to do.
Get up in it.
All right, so Stephen Gregory Stayner was born on April 18th, 1965 to Delbert and Kay Stayner, Merced, California. So he had three sisters, Cynthia, Corey, and Jody, and then he had an older brother named Cary. We'll get to him later in the episode. We'll talk about him. When Stephen was 7 years old, he was walking home from school. It was December 4th, 1972, and he was approached by two men. One man, Irvin Murphy, explained that he was a member of the local church and he was collecting donations, and he'd asked Stephen if he thought that maybe Stephen's mother would be able to donate to the church. And the man asked Stephen where he lived, and he told him that they would be happy to drive him to his house to get the donation from Stephen's mother. And, not thinking anything of it, just an innocent 7-year-old naive boy, he was like, yeah, okay, like, take me home. My mom would probably donate. Irvin brings him over to the car. It's a white Buick, and he's not the one driving. So the driver of the vehicle was 41-year-old Kenneth Parnell. Yeah, so we're going to talk about Kenneth Parnell for a little bit. Just get a background on this driver. He was born in Amarillo, Texas in 1931. Kenneth, his mother Mary, and he had 2 half-sisters and a half-brother. They were abandoned by his alcoholic father, Cecil, when Kenneth was about 6 years old. So Cecil was actually Mary's second husband. That's where his half-sisters and half-brother came from, her first marriage. But Cecil could not handle how controlling Mary was over literally everything, like controlling over their family, controlling over their children, controlling over things outside of their family. She was super controlling of them. She tried to force them to conform to her very, very strict conservative Christian beliefs. And Cecil was like, yeah, no, it's just not me. The children, the husband, everybody had to be perfect. It had to be exactly how she wanted. And he was like, nah. So he left. Kenneth, his mother, and his half-siblings moved to Bakersfield, California, and he had a very disturbed childhood. He was in and out of juvenile prison mental institutions up until his 20s, throughout his childhood, teenage years, everything. A psychiatrist named Dr. Richard D. Lowenberg saw Kenneth as a child, and according to his records, at the age of 4, Kenneth attempted to rip out his own teeth with his hands.
What?
They weren't loose at all. He was just like literally trying to rip them out.
Ah.
Yeah. At 9 years old, he said that Kenneth was considering suicide monthly, and he recalled 2 suicide attempts, one where he actually shot himself in the abdomen, and then another where Parnell jumped off a roof of a barn onto a plank that had like nails sticking up.
Shut up.
Yeah, I think only 2 barely grazed him. Yeah, no, he got lucky, I guess. I don't know. At age 13, there isn't much known about this because I know that later, like, he didn't really like talking about it, but he was a victim of rape by another man. And 2 years after this, he was accused of arson. So we're definitely seeing erratic turning into violent behavior after violence is committed upon him. So at 16, he was arrested for, quote, homosexual public sex acts. Obviously today it would not be called that. He would not be charged with something like that. This was just, you know, back in the day. So he was eventually released into his mother's custody and then ended up stealing a car, and then he was sent to serve time in the California Youth Authority's Lancaster facility. So like even when he got out and was free and okay, he ended up just going right back into whatever juvenile facility or mental institution. Within weeks of being there, he escaped and he returned to Bakersfield because he had become sexually attracted to a young boy that was there. So like that's why he wanted to go back. And he was soon arrested again, and then he was put back into jail, and he attempted suicide by ingesting disinfectant. So he was in the hospital being treated, and then once he was released, he was sent to a mental facility for 3 months. He then escaped from this mental facility, stole another car, went back to Bakersfield for the same boy, was rearrested, and stayed in Lancaster then until 1949 when he was let out.
This is wild. So how young was this boy that you're speaking of?
This boy, I'm going to assume his preferential age is like between 5 and 9.
I'm going to throw up. Okay.
I don't know who this boy specifically is, if it's one of the boys that later, like, I'm going to talk about it in a minute. I don't think they ever really reveal who it was because there was no crime associated with it.
Okay.
So when he was 19 years old, he was arrested for, we both hate this word, for sodomizing a 9-year-old boy named Bobby and impersonating a police officer with a fake sheriff's badge that he literally bought from a store. Basically, he approached 3 young boys and he talked one of them, Bobby, into coming with him. And he considered killing the boy in order to keep anyone from finding out, but ultimately decided against it. But yeah, he like took him to an isolated area and sexually assaulted him. So he ended up just like dropping him back off, and the boy just ran and went right to his parents and was like, yeah, this happened. His parents reported it. So that's why we know and why he was arrested. In an interview he did later on, Parnell explained that the reason he abused the boy was, and this is a direct quote, "My wife was pregnant and she was just too big for me, I guess, and I had to find another outlet."
No.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
No.
Yeah, he had married in 1950 and she'd gotten pregnant the following year, which was the year that he'd sodomized Bobby. And she had their daughter. They ended up divorcing in 1957, and he married again that same year and had another daughter. He claims there was a third marriage, but nobody has ever been able to find any record of it. So really not sure what that's about.
I'm so confused.
Yeah, this guy was a mess. He's a monster.
This is a mess.
So then in the 60s, he served time in Utah State Prison for robbery and grand larceny. So during the trial for this, he was examined by 3 different psychiatrists, and they found a lot of the same information, but they had some different viewpoints. They found that, first of all, he had little to no supervision or discipline from his parents whatsoever throughout his life. You can kind of see where that gets you. He was doing all of these things when he was still a teenager. This crime that he committed, he was just 19 years old, and he'd done all those things beforehand. And he was in and out of facilities. So he was not learning his lesson, and no one was disciplining him. I mean, it was just his mom. They all agreed that he was a sexual psychopath. Dr. Nash said that he had a psychopathic personality with well-defined homosexual drives, tendency and predisposition to commit sexual offense to a degree of constituting him a menace to the health and safety of others. Once again, want to touch on the fact that obviously being homosexual would not be considered anything having to do with mental illness today. This was just way back in the day, in the 40s. Dr. Lowenberg said that he had an extremely unstable emotional personality, and his anxieties and insecurities worked themselves out in sex acts and theft. I think he said that he was super intelligent, but his disturbances were due to his impulsivity. He further confirmed that he was a sexual psychopath, and he said that he thought treatment would help him. So after this, he was sentenced to 4 years in prison. He was also being treated at Nowak State Hospital for 3 months. He escaped.
How?
He escaped, and he was caught and put in maximum security prison. And then he escaped again. And I'm pretty sure he was able to get the lock off of a door for this one. I don't know how, but he escaped again, and he wasn't caught for 3 months in Albuquerque, New Mexico.
In the words of 6ix9ine, are you dumb, stupid, or dumb?
So that's just a little background on him. We're going to go fast forward back to 1972 when they approached this boy, Stephen Stayner. So Edwin Murphy was the one who got Steve into the car, and Parnell was the one driving. So Parnell was actually the brains of the operation. Parnell and Murphy worked together at Yosemite Lodge, and Parnell used his powers of manipulation to convince Murphy, who actually had an intellectual disability. He convinced him to pass out gospel tracts to young boys. He told Murphy that he was a religious leader and there were a lot of battered kids who needed homes, and he said that he wanted to take care of an underprivileged kid. And, Murphy was he was disabled. He was easily manipulated by Parnell, and he'd also confided in Parnell, and he told him about how he too was abused as a child. So he's hearing how Parnell wants to help these kids. Obviously he's going to admire him and want to help him out. He trusts this guy. He's like, oh my God, this guy is saving these kids who were in the same boat I was. So obviously Parnell was using this to his advantage as a means of manipulation. So he drove up to his cabin in Cathy's Valley, which was about 20 miles from Merced. And later on, Murphy said that he figured something was wrong because they weren't going back to Stephen's house like he thought. But Stephen wasn't crying at all, and he wasn't scared even when they got to the cabin. So he was like, all right, it must be okay then, or else this kid would be crying. And Parnell then threatened Murphy, and he said that if he told anyone about what was happening, he would be in the exact same boat and would get in just as much trouble as he would.
Blackmail.
So on the way to the cabin, Parnell stopped at a payphone and came back, and he told Stephen he'd just called his parents, spoke on the phone to them, and they were like, yeah, he can totally spend the night. It's okay. So he made Stephen think that he literally called his parents and asked. They were like, yeah.
Oh, yes, please take my son for the night.
Keep in mind, he is a 7-year-old kid. He has no idea what's going on. If you're like, oh, my parents said it, then obviously you're going to believe it.
You're going to be like, oh, okay.
So they get to the cabin. He had a bunch of toys for Stephen to play with, trying to get him to trust him and think that he's in a good situation. But he began molesting Stephen right away that first night. And then after about 2 weeks, he progressed to full-on rape. And Stephen had told him countless times that first week that he wanted to go home, but Parnell ultimately told him that he was now his legal guardian, and Stephen's parents couldn't afford to have as many kids as they had, and they no longer wanted him.
That's so sad.
So he would give him Nytol, which is an antihistamine, to put him to sleep. And so this is really, really sad. They had no idea at the time, but this cabin was only hundreds of feet away from his grandparents' house. Mm-hmm.
Oh, no.
Mm-hmm. He renamed him Stephen Dennis Gregory Parnell and was just truly forcing him to take on the identity of being his son. He enrolled him in several different schools over the years. Like, they kept on moving around to different cities all over the state of California. And he gave him drugs, alcohol, cigarettes. He was allowed to drink and smoke as he pleased. He literally could do whatever he wanted. Parnell gave him so much freedom just so that in return, he could do these disgusting, unspeakable things to him. So yeah, he was 7, 8, 9, 10 years old, just like getting drunk whenever he wanted, smoking how many ever cigarettes he wanted.
Jesus.
People around them who saw them in public truly believed they were father and son. Nothing raised any red flags. Parnell had a job. Everything just looked so normal. And obviously behind closed doors, he continued to abuse Stephen every day. I know in later interviews, Stephen had once said that he was abused 700 something times, and Parnell, being an asshole, was like, he wasn't very good at counting. It was like 3,000. Mm-hmm. When recalling the abuse in later interviews, Stephen said that it was something that at the time he literally thought was normal, and maybe it was just something he'd never heard of or experienced yet. And he did talk to Parnell about how much it hurt. And like I said, he said that he'd been raped hundreds and hundreds of times. Meanwhile, the Stayner family was desperately searching day and night for Stephen, but there were some obstacles that were preventing them from doing so. I know this is your least favorite part of every crime case. So let's just talk about some things that, if they'd happened differently, things might have been different.
This shit gonna piss me off.
Yeah. So missing posters were said to have been put up in Yosemite, like all around the parks, everywhere, like near the lodge where he was abducted, everything where he worked. But no one that had been there in the years 1972 and 1973 had ever seen them there. They'd never seen a single missing poster of this boy. So were they really put up? I don't know.
Probably not.
Probably not. And so even though Parnell was arrested for sodomizing a 9-year-old boy, and he was supposed to legally register as a sex offender, he never did. So when police were searching for possible suspects, they were obviously looking at sex offenders. He wasn't on the list, so he wasn't even on their radar. If he'd been on that list, he definitely would have been considered a suspect.
Why didn't they register him as one? Why did he have to do it?
They have to do it themselves. I don't know if that law has changed. I don't know much about these laws, especially in California.
I'm going to hit somebody.
I know. So the FBI also subpoenaed a list of employees at the Yosemite Lodge. And after waiting 3 months to get this list back, they got a list with only half of the employees. And the other half of the employees, including Parnell, were purposely excluded from the list because they were paid on alternate weeks than the employees listed. So, like, I'm assuming they weren't supposed to be. Something illegal was happening. But yeah, he was excluded from this list. If he had been registered as a sex offender and his name had been on this list, he, without a doubt, would have been one of the top suspects, if not the top suspect that they looked at.
Good. That's good. Good to know.
So about a month after Stephen's abduction, he was enrolled in Steel Lane Elementary School by Parnell. The school district office received a letter from the Stayner family with flyers that the Stayners requested to have distributed to all the schools in the district. So not just Steel Lane, but like the middle schools, whatever. Years later, the Stayners discovered that the letter and those flyers had been thrown away, and they were never distributed to the schools in the district. They found the same to be true with other schools that Parnell had enrolled Stephen in.
What the hell?
What is your reasoning for throwing them away? Like, what? You don't think that's important? You literally work with children.
I literally want to play that sound bit from Cardi B that was like, what was the reason? And she's like screaming. The fact that it's a school. You're supposed to, protect children. So if somebody comes in and they're saying that a kid is in danger, why is your first reaction to throw these flyers away?
And the fact that they did it at multiple schools, And, like, oddly enough, he used, like, his same middle name, his same birthday, everything, and, like, nobody ever picked up on it.
Because nobody wanted to raise a flag. Jeez Louise.
Those are just a few of the circumstances that, had they been different, maybe things would have turned out differently. Back to the situation in this cabin. So he had, like, a mistress type girlfriend woman situation going on. Her name was Barbara, and she stayed with them for 18 months. So this was starting when he was like 9 up until he was like 11. And she shared a bed with the two of them, and she raped Stephen a total of 9 times.
She did it too?
Yeah, she did. And strangely enough, her 2 sons had been abused by Parnell, and she even reported this to the police, but they didn't believe her.
Shut up. Mm-hmm. What the heck?
Yeah, and it makes me so angry because later, we'll kind of talk about it, but she says she had no idea that any of this was going on.
How? You did it too.
Yeah, gross, gross, gross. But during this time, Stephen was not the only boy Parnell assaulted. A police report had been filed by the mother of another boy alleging that he'd sodomized her son as well. And Stephen even admitted that he was in the room over while it was happening. And later, when he was asked about Parnell abusing Stephen's friends, he said, well, I figured if he was assaulting them, that he wasn't assaulting me. He said that Parnell had made him and one of his classmates pose for numerous nude photos, and in total, Parnell had abused 4 other boys in Stephen's class. Here's another thing. So he actually got Stephen a dog, which we already know this manipulative tactic from the Ariel Castro case.
Yes.
He was doing these things to kind of gain his trust and make him seem like, no, I'm your dad. I'm giving you things and letting you do things. Like, I'm doing this to make you happy. Stephen doesn't think he was abducted. He thinks his family didn't want him. So
true.
It's different than Michelle Knight knowing she was abducted and that this person was holding her captive and that she hates this person and he made her feel crazy because he did something nice. This is like, he thinks his family doesn't want him. This is his life and this is what it's supposed to be like. He does not know the difference.
That's so sad.
So sad. All in all, Stephen was held captive for 8 years. Eventually, he started to go through puberty, and he was growing out of Parnell's preferential age. Because of this, Parnell wanted to abduct another boy, because, of course, he couldn't do it himself, and he had to have other people doing all his dirty work. He had Barbara help him, and she failed. So he enlisted Stephen's assistance.
Great.
It just didn't happen with Stephen helping him, and Parnell just deemed him incompetent. But Stephen comes out in later interviews saying that he completely, purposely sabotaged any of Parnell's plans to abduct another boy.
Well, that's good.
It is, but once Parnell deemed him incompetent, he sought help from one of Stephen's classmates named Sean Portman. So he bribed Sean with drugs and cash, and when Sean tried to back out eventually in the end, he threatened him, and so Sean was like, okay, whatever, I'll help you. So their plan was to lure 5-year-old Timothy White to their car by asking for help, and Timothy said no, as he should. Everyone, when you have children, if you have not told them, you need to tell them. Men do not ever need your help. If a man asks you for help, you say no, or you don't even say anything, you run away. No man ever needs your help, especially if you are a child. What are you going to do for them? So Timmy was smart. He said no. But Sean chased him down and threw him into Parnell's car, so it didn't even matter.
Great.
Parnell immediately dyed his blonde hair brown, changed his clothes, changed everything, didn't want anyone to be able to recognize him, and he told him the same things that he told Stephen when he first abducted Stephen. He was like, your family doesn't want you, I'm your dad, you're my son, this is your life now. This kid was even younger than Stephen was. He was 5 years old. He was like just barely a child.
It's a baby.
And Stephen watched as Parnell repeated the exact same behaviors that he did just 7.5, 8 years ago, which made Stephen come to terms with what had been happening throughout his abduction. So this made him really realize how messed up things were and that he didn't want this to happen to someone else. This is kind of where things became a lot clearer to him. He was like, holy shit, this is not real. Timmy has a family looking for him. What if my family actually wants me and they're looking for me too? I'm not letting this happen to this kid. So he did everything in his power to keep Timmy from being abused like he'd been abused. And he made sure he came home early every single day from school. Like he literally came home at noon every single day so that Parnell never got the opportunity to be alone with Timmy and put him through what he put Stephen through. There were several times that Stephen wanted to try and escape with Timmy, but it wasn't until March 1st, 1980 that the perfect opportunity came. Parnell was working the night shift as a security officer, so Stephen and Timmy hitchhiked over 40 miles to Timmy's hometown of Ukiah, California. Stephen carried Timmy much of the way, but Timmy couldn't remember where he lived. They were able to find his babysitter's house, but no one was home. They ended up going to the police station, and Stephen told Timmy to just go inside on his own. He was intending on taking off. And Timmy went in, but he was so scared to be without Stephen that he ended up running back out crying, and they were spotted by a police officer, and so they had no choice but to tell police officers who they were. So there's a super famous quote, because they did end up making like a Lifetime movie off this, but he says to the officer, "I know my first name is Steven. I think my last name is Stayner." He didn't know how to spell his last name, so he wrote it down. So at first the officer didn't realize who it was. He didn't realize it was Steven Stayner, the boy who was abducted 7 years ago. Mm-hmm. But they eventually realized who it was. They detained them. And at first, Stephen wouldn't give up Parnell's name unless police agreed to get him help if it was determined that he was sick, which just kind of shows that
he thought that he cared for this person enough to not realize how bad the situation was. He still wanted to help him.
100%. He thought this guy was like his dad for 7 years. So Parnell was arrested that morning at his job, and Stephen had to go into the interrogation room to identify him. Parnell was only tried for kidnapping and not for sexual abuse. He was convicted of both charges for both kidnappings and served 5 years of his sentence, which in total I think was like 8. Murphy was sentenced to 5 years as well and was paroled after 2. Sean Foreman was sentenced to work in a juvenile camp. Barbara was never charged. So if you're wondering about the length of a sentence, so at the time, and this was 1981, per California law, the 2 sentences, so both kidnappings, had to be merged, but they could not exceed the maximum sentence, which was 9 years, I believe. So he received 7 years for Timothy and only 20 months for Stephen, despite having him held captive for 2,644 days.
I am appalled.
As for the sexual assault charge, he was not charged with the numerous sexual assaults on not just Stayner, but on his classmates as well, because the majority of them occurred outside of the jurisdiction of the Merced County prosecutor, or by then they were outside of the statute of limitations.
That just grinds my freaking gears.
Yes. I will say both of these laws are completely different now.
Thank God.
If this had happened today, he 100% would have been given numerous sexual assault charges. He would have received a much longer sentence for both kidnappings. But the statute of limitations for sexual assault in California at the time was 3 years. So anything before 1977, they didn't even consider. Despite the fact that the prosecution conceded they could have still charged him with 87 counts of sexual assault against Stephen that occurred after 77, they didn't do it. It was mostly because they didn't want to bring any more harm to Stephen. That was a point in time where sexual abuse, sexual assault was not talked about, especially when it occurred with men. We even talked about how that one crime he committed, it was like homosexual acts in public. These things were not what they are today. Mm-hmm. So for them to have a whole public trial where they talk about how Stephen was sexually abused thousands of times, they thought that at a public safety standpoint, at like a well-being standpoint, it would have made things way worse for him. Obviously, this was going to be super hard for him as is. I definitely think it would have been different today. I just think because of the time and just because of attitudes towards these things, they just didn't want to bring it to light. So Parnell's defense attorney pressed upon the fact that Stephen was free to leave at any time and literally just chose not to. He literally had Stockholm Syndrome 1, 2. He had nowhere to go because he thought that his family didn't want him and abandoned him. And anyway, he wouldn't even know how to get there if he did. He was a brainwashed child.
They clearly did forget that, because that's ridiculous to say.
So ridiculous. And, the prosecution argued that Parnell was creating a psychological prison, basically. And I like the way that they put this, but they said the kidnapping wasn't just one incident that happened on December 4th, 1972. but it was one that had occurred every single day for 7 years. Tell me how he was going to leave that. So psychologist Dr. Philip Ham testified at the trial, further confirming that Stephen was brainwashed. He said Parnell exerted strong psychological influences over Stayner by alternating sexual abuse and threats with pleasurable experiences. You know, he kind of let him do whatever he wanted. He gave him a dog. He gave him toys. He said that he further molded Stayner's mind by telling him a court had given him custody of the boy and that his parents had abandoned him. What are you supposed to think? You are a child. Someone is telling you that they have a legal obligation to take care of you. You're not going to question it.
No.
And Parnell tried to use the defense in court that he didn't kidnap Timothy and that he was blackmailed. And he started saying that there was like a man named Hank and he was the one who did it and all this stuff. And he also said that Stephen wasn't remembering things correctly. And he said that Timothy was hypnotized to say what he said in his testimony. So he was just pulling everything out of his ass, trying to maintain his innocence.
No, sir.
So here's something else that was very odd that came to light. But they found in his cabin that Parnell had an old law book. And in it, he had defenses written out for 4 crimes. So rape, robbery, kidnapping, and murder, which, you know, it was weird because they were like, well, he did all of these crimes, except why does he have murder, like a defense written out for murder here, if like he never did murder? Well, Sean Porman's brother alleged that Parnell forced Sean to bury children for him. And allegedly, Parnell had already dug a grave for Stephen and had intended to relocate with Timmy once Stephen was out of the picture. I have a couple opinions.
Okay. I'm so confused.
The reason why I would think that he wouldn't murder the children was because of that first sodomy instance where he had the opportunity to kill the kid and he didn't, and he let him go. It just doesn't seem like murder is in this guy's MO. It just looks like all that he was a sexual predator. On the other hand, Stephen growing out of his preferential age would give him reason to, I understand, killing him, relocating with Timmy, pretending that this never happened type of thing. Also, another thing was Parnell had been with Stephen in a county at the same time when 2 children's bodies were discovered in shallow graves, you know, like the ones that Sean Porman allegedly dug for Parnell. So that was an interesting coincidence, never confirmed, but I understand why people were like piecing these things together. So let's talk about the aftermath of this whole thing. So life, as you can imagine, was not easy for Stephen after the trial. He had a very hard time adjusting. So first and foremost, he was teased by a bunch of his classmates in school about the sexual abuse. Ultimately, he ended up just dropping out because he couldn't take it anymore. And then I want to remind you the way that he'd been raised by Parnell. He had complete freedom. He literally could do whatever he wanted. He was able to smoke and drink and do whatever he wanted. So he returned to like a happy, healthy, normal home life where when you were 15, 16 years old, you weren't really able to do those things. It was really hard for him to adjust. And it was to the point where he wondered if it would have been better if he just never came home. He saw a counselor like a couple times at the beginning, but his parents did not believe in therapy. They were very weird when it came to showing emotion. I think, once again, this is just something about that time. They didn't want him to go to therapy, so after those first couple of counseling sessions, he didn't go. But he said, I returned almost a grown man, and yet my parents still saw me as their 7-year-old. After they stopped trying to teach me the fundamentals all over again, it got better. But why doesn't my dad hug me anymore? Everything has changed. Sometimes I blame myself. I don't know sometimes if I should have come home. Would I have been better off if I didn't? So that was like really, really sad. I mean, it was definitely an adjustment for the entire family. And I just think the whole like dealing with emotions and hiding emotions for everybody was kind of making it more difficult without them really realizing it. You know, he was having these problems with drinking and smoking. In high school, he was hospitalized after drinking had caused him to tear the lining of his stomach, and he was bleeding internally as well.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. It was to the point where he'd been smoking 2 packs of cigs a day, and he was driving recklessly. Like, things were really bad. By 1989, his license had been suspended 3 times for all the tickets that he racked up. So when he returned home, he got $40,000. $15,000 of it was from returning Timmy, and $25,000 of it was for that TV movie deal. So he blew through $40,000 in 3 months.
What?
Mm-hmm.
That's so much money. That's some people's yearly salary.
So much money. So ultimately, his dad ended up kicking him out of his own home. That's insane to me. Your son was abducted for 7 years and
I do get that.
And you got him back only to kick him out. And it's so sad because clearly he needed help so bad. But nobody in that family, they didn't know how to deal with those things.
Yeah.
He wasn't going to get it. So once he was in his 20s, he finally started to get his life together. He started working with different groups that helped with missing sexually exploited children. He started to like speak at little events, and he was helping these groups. And he ended up marrying Jody Edmondson, and they had 2 children together, and he wanted to work in law enforcement.
Oh.
He also joined the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints.
Huh. That goddamn church somehow always just appears, huh?
All of our cases, I swear. On September 16th, 1989, Stephen was leaving work at a pizza restaurant on a rainy night. His boss offered him the company truck to drive home in so that he wouldn't get wet, but Stephen didn't want to keep getting in trouble for driving without a license, so he just rode home on his motorbike to his family. He was like in a rush to get home. He just wanted to see them. On his way home, a car pulled out from the side of the road and collided with 24-year-old helmetless Stephen. The helmet that he usually wore had actually been stolen 3 days before this accident.
Oh my gosh.
The driver left Stephen in the road, thrown 45 feet from his vehicle to succumb to his injuries. He died of several head injuries. The driver was later identified by witnesses and had received only 3 months in jail and a $100 fine.
What?
500 people attended his funeral.
My gosh.
But it ain't over, because I know all these things before I started researching this case.
Oh my gosh.
And I tell you that we're just getting started.
We're 50 minutes in.
Man, we're just getting started. No, we're like halfway, but like the things to come. But that is so sad. When I first heard this case and read that absolutely broke my heart, especially because he started to get his life together. He had this beautiful family. His helmet literally had been stolen 3 days before this accident. Just the entire thing is heartbreaking.
Yeah, I feel terrible for him and his family.
I know. And his wife even talked about how he was like getting his shit together and he was starting to do really well and he was just a good person. Timothy White, he ended up becoming a deputy for the LA County Sheriff's Department in 2005. He married a woman named Dina, with whom he also had 2 children. Sadly, he died in 2010 at the age of 35 from a pulmonary embolism.
That's so young.
So young. So now let's talk about Kenneth Parnell. We talked about how he didn't serve his entire sentence. He was paroled in 1987, and he got a job as a night watchman for a house where a young boy lived. But after that docuseries about Stephen's kidnapping came out, it was called I Know My First Name is Stephen, because remember, that's what he said to the police. He ended up being fired.
I don't even know how they got him the job in the first place.
They didn't do background checks. So in January 2003, he was arrested again. This time, he attempted to force his caregiver into buying him a 4-year-old African-American boy for $500. He had a caregiver because he was 71 and his health was declining rapidly and he required like round-the-clock care. The day that he was to receive the child, January 3rd, he was arrested. The prosecution planned to get Parnell on the 3 strikes felony law and put him away for life. But the defense planned to argue that the prior felonies were too old to be considered relevant.
No.
Like, I don't care how old they are, they're severe enough to be considered relevant.
They happened for long periods of time. How are you going to argue that?
But the prosecution pointed out that in Parnell's attempt to secure the child, he asked to make sure that the child's, I don't want to say this, he asked to make sure that the child's rectum was clean. And the prosecutor said that this indicated how sinister he was. On February 9th, 2004, he was convicted of attempting to purchase a child and attempted molestation. Because authorities seized sexual aids and child pornography from his apartment, they were able to argue that Parnell's intent was indeed criminal. And under California's 3 strikes law, he was sentenced to 25 to life. He died in 2008 at the age of 76 in prison. He had been under hospice care for quite some time, and he passed away.
I am just glad he is not alive.
Me too. So, obviously, we talked about Stephen Stayner, how he was affected. We talked a little bit about Timothy. We talked about Kenneth Parnell and what happened with him. I want to talk about the Stayner family. More specifically, I want to talk about the oldest Stayner child, Cary Stayner. So Cary Anthony Stayner, the brother of Stephen Stayner, was born on August 13th, 1961. He was 4 years older than Stephen. He was 11 years old when Stephen had been abducted. After Stephen was abducted, Mr. Stayner became absolutely engulfed in the possibility of finding his son. He cried at the news, which Cary said that he had never seen his dad cry before in his life.
Aww.
The other children hid their emotions and they weren't paid as much attention to. One of the siblings, Cynthia, recalls that the children were, quote, kind of on their own after Stephen went missing. Their father was suicidal and very depressed. He was pushing his children away, even going as far as to say that his real son was gone. So the hiding of emotions by children was most likely mirrored by, obviously, their father, but their mother, Kay. So Kay's mother, which was obviously the children's grandfather, he told her to look at the kidnapping as a good thing because she now had one less child to feed and worry about.
What?
So messed up.
That's so messed up.
Yeah. But he told her to never cry or show emotion at the risk of seeming crazy like her own mother was. So you can clearly see where this hide your emotions, like play it cool demeanor was developed from.
It's your child, though. Like, come on.
A psychiatrist recounts Cary's troubled childhood even before the abduction of his brother. So he was messed up even before this happened. He began pulling out copious amounts of his own hair between the ages of 2 and 4. So he was diagnosed with trichotillomania, I think it's pronounced, but that's when you pull out your hair. It's a form of OCD. He was prescribed medication at 3 years old for this. Special Agent Jeremy Rennick said that when Cary was only 6 or 7 years old, he began having sadistic thoughts of harming women and young girls. His first fantasy was about killing female cashiers while waiting for his parents in the grocery store. And when he was 8, he imagined having a girl neighbor trapped under a bunker. When he was 11, he imagined his mom being kidnapped, and he imagined women being forced to march naked and being gang raped. So he started clearly having very disturbed fantasies of killing, raping, torturing women. And as he got older, they kind of progressed and got worse and worse. When he was 11, this was actually right before Stephen's abduction. He was molested by his uncle, Jesse, also known as Jerry Stayner. Like I said, it was the same year that Stephen was abducted. It was like right before. It was also well known by older male cousins that his uncle Jesse was a pedophile who abused the young males in their family, but the children were still allowed to sleep over his apartment. And after Stephen had been kidnapped, Cary wondered if he was at fault. He wondered if it was like his disturbed thoughts or what caused it to happen. I don't know if it was kind of like a karma thing or what, but that's like what he was thinking. At the age of 16, he molested his sister's friend, who was also their neighbor, while she slept over. And as his fantasies and thoughts grew more disturbing, he also began to hear voices and noises, and he claimed that he'd been receiving messages from the TV and that the end of the world was near.
Oh my gosh, he gone.
Mm-hmm. So eventually Stephen returned home. He's getting all of this attention because, you know, he was abducted and he escaped and he came back. So Cary was jealous of all of the attention that he was getting, and he felt super ignored. The children were neglected for the 7 years that Stephen was gone. I understand that. Stephen comes back, they're still feeling neglected. So the father, Delbert Stayner, was actually ordered to therapy by authorities in 1986 after he began molesting one or more, I don't know if it was one or both, of their daughters.
Oh my gosh.
Mm-hmm. And one of the girls also admitted that Cary began peeping on her and touching her inappropriately when she was only 10. A cousin said that Cary had spied on her and neighbors hiding under the bed and videotaping them in the bedroom and bathroom. What is happening, you ask? Well, Rennick said that a family member once described the child's sexual abuse as a, quote, family sickness because it had been going on through 5 generations of their family.
What?
Yep.
Whoa.
When I read about this abduction of Stephen and read how he died, I knew none of this. None of this. None of this. The whole family.
This is the ripple effect you talked about?
Whole family. Yeah, this is the ripple effect, but we're not there yet.
Oh my God. I don't want to go there if that's where we're going.
So at the age of 28, this was 1989, this was right before his brother was killed. He had like a total nervous breakdown. And it happened when he was like with one of his coworkers, and he said to his coworker that he felt like getting in his truck and driving into the office of the glass company that they worked at and killing their boss and everybody in there and then torching the place. And his coworker was like, dude, you need to get help.
Clearly.
So soon after his brother's death, Cary moved in with his uncle Jesse.
No, bad idea. Bad idea. Terrible idea.
In the same year, his uncle was found shot dead in his home.
Well, didn't I say it was a bad idea?
There were no suspects.
There were none?
None.
I could think of one.
It was... You could give me one?
I mean, just like pick it out of a hat, maybe?
Cary Stayner, it was believed he was at work at the time. We'll circle back. The following year, he attempted suicide by carbon monoxide poisoning. In 1995, he had another nervous breakdown and ended up being treated at Merced County Mental Health Department. 2 years later, he'd been arrested on marijuana and methamphetamine charges, and his mobile home was repossessed. He did, however, manage to get a job as a hotel handyman at Cedar Lodge in Yosemite.
Count me out.
It's just crazy, like all these things happening in the same place.
It's very wild.
Very wild. On February 15th, 1999, 3 tourists at Cedar Lodge, 42-year-old Carol Sund, her 15-year-old daughter Julie, and their 16-year-old family friend Silvina Peloso went missing. The following month, the remains of Carol Sund and Silvina Peloso were found in the car they'd rented out. It was found several hours away from the lodge, and it was completely torched. Julie Sund's body was found about an hour away from the vehicle later on. Investigators questioned Cary Stayner, but they didn't think he had anything to do with it because he had no history of violence in his past. He had like drug charges, but there was nothing of any violent nature. So like, why would they think it's him? One of the victims' throat was slashed. So instead, they questioned the other employees and the criminals in the town of Modesto because that's where they found the wallet of Carol Sund. So you've got their bodies, you've got the other person's body an hour away, you've got the wallet in a completely different place, very disorganized. So on July 22nd, 1999, the decapitated body of 26-year-old Joey Armstrong was found near her cabin in Yosemite. Authorities questioned Cary again and this time searched his truck, but they let him go. On July 24th, Cary confessed to the 4 murders to Special Agent Rennick, who we were talking about earlier. He murdered Carol and Silvina on February 15th and Julie the next day. 2 days later, he went back to burn the rental car and get Carol's wallet. Julie's body was actually found because of an anonymous letter Cary himself sent to the FBI. The note read, "We had fun with this one."
Leave immediately.
The way you're looking right now is like you're getting some crazy tea.
I am getting crazy tea. What are you talking about? This is insane.
After his confession, authorities began to look at him for 2 other unsolved murders. One being his uncle.
Didn't I say?
You did say. And then another one was a woman named Sherilyn Mavone, whose decapitated body was found 5 years earlier. It was in a nearby place in California. The same MO, similar victimology, so that's kind of why they were piecing things together, just seeing it's very common for them to connect unsolved murders once someone confesses like this. While waiting to stand trial, Cary was evaluated by psychiatrists who did a brain scan that found schizophrenia, psychotic disorder, and OCD. During this trial, psychiatrists diagnosed him with like 20 different mental illnesses. This kid was messed up, and obviously that was clear since he was an infant that he was messed up.
I was about to say, this is no news, truly.
But the defense hoped to use this evidence to prove that he was legally insane at the time of the murders. But the prosecution asked for the scans to be excluded from the trial, arguing that PET scans were not generally accepted by scientists to address human behavior, including homicidal and violent tendencies. So, while you can prove that he did have these abnormalities in his brain, you can't sit here and say, hey, this in his brain is what caused him to do this.
Exactly.
Causation does not equal correlation.
Hey, good one.
In 2002, he pled not guilty by reason of insanity. He was found sane and convicted on 4 counts of first-degree murder. In December of 2002, he was sentenced to death by lethal injection. I'm pretty sure he's still chilling on death row.
And death on death penalty.
Sure is. So, the psychology of these.
There are so many things.
There are a lot of things. I really don't think that we need to go into too much detail regarding Kenneth Parnell. I think that it's pretty clear, just based on his childhood, kind of where he was headed.
I feel like a lot of the psychology and the profiles of them were already uncovered throughout the case, too.
Definitely. And I mean, you just kind of see his behavior starting at a young age and kind of progressing. And Cary, that's going to be a lot more complex, but it's also very apparent when you look at his upbringing and his family dynamic. So I do want to talk about a study. It is called The Role of Escalating Paraphilic Fantasies and Behaviors in Sexual, Sadistic, and Serial Violence. This study examines the emergence and escalation of paraphilic fantasies in relation to sadistic, sexual, and serial violence. Let's take a look at Cary. It's clear just by his MO that he is a disorganized, thrill-seeking sexual sadist. Some might argue that he could be a mix of disorganized and organized, but he does fit a lot of the characteristics of disorganized killers. When he was younger, he did not date women at all. He liked girls. He had sex with some girls, but he just wouldn't date. And he was a good looking guy. A lot of girls were into him, and his friends would even talk about it, but he was just super weird and he just wouldn't date. So that is a characteristic of someone who is a disorganized killer. They rarely date. A lot of the time they live alone. So he did live alone once his uncle was killed. He lived in that mobile home, working at or near the place of the murder, which he did. Engaging in handiwork, things like that, manual labor, which he did. Significant behavioral changes clearly throughout his entire life. They just progressed and progressed and progressed. So let's just think he wanted the same publicity that his brother had. He wanted his own movie. He wanted one about him. And I want to take a look at Hickey's trauma-controlled model, which talks about 8 key features that would lead one to commit these crimes. So Hickey's model includes predispositional factors, traumatic events, low self-esteem and fantasies, dissociation, trauma reinforcers, facilitators, increasingly violent fantasies, and homicidal behavior. You don't have to go A to B to C to D. You don't have to have all of them. You do not have to go in order, but ultimately a mix of them will lead to the end, which is the increasingly violent fantasies, ultimately homicidal behavior. So these predispositional factors can be biological, psychological, and sociological. So it definitely could have been a mix of Cary's psychological illnesses as well as his sociological upbringing. His neglect by his parents after his brother's abduction and after his return, as well as his inability to convey or process his emotions as mirrored after his parents, which was mirrored after their parents. So it runs in the family. Not only does pedophilia run in the family, but so does masking your emotions and not understanding them or being able to process them. If no one's talking about it, no one's teaching you, you're not going to understand.
Exactly.
Traumatic events. Obviously, he experienced very traumatic events. The abduction of his own brother, his abuse at the hands of his uncle, someone he trusted, the neglect by his parents can also be considered a trauma. Hickey argued that the ongoing predispositional factors can exacerbate the traumatic events. So whether or not you consider neglect a form of trauma, it exacerbated those traumatic events. It made them even worse. Low self-esteem and fantasies. So when looking at his childhood leading up to his violent crimes, there are very clear indicators that he had low self-esteem. His psychiatrist actually confirmed that he was impotent for 15 years. So if you're wondering why he wouldn't date, I feel like that kind of makes sense. He was probably embarrassed that he couldn't perform. But obviously that is something that for a man that's going to make you have very low self-esteem. He was also teased in school because he was balding, so there's another hit. He also, obviously, he felt ignored and neglected compared to his brother Stephen, who was receiving attention during his abduction and after his return. And the spotlight being on Stephen and not being on him probably made him feel super shitty. So all in all, he's feeling alone. He's feeling bad about himself. As for fantasies, we touched on those. He had a lot of them. They were violent in nature, they were sexual in nature, and they got worse and worse and worse as he got older. Facilitators. So these are things like drugs, alcohol, or pornography that the offender becomes addicted to, kind of as like an outlet, until they're completely desensitized to these facilitators, and ultimately they need to act on their depraved fantasies. So it's like they're kind of using it so that they don't act on their fantasies, and after a while it's not enough anymore and they need to finally act. So remember, he was arrested for marijuana and methamphetamine, so those were the facilitators in his defense. I mean, I'm sure there was pornography involved, because when he ultimately got convicted, he asked for porn. I think he asked for child porn even, but obviously he had those facilitators and they didn't end up holding up for him, and he ended up needing to act on his fantasies. So with this model, he pretty much hits everything. Dissociation is probably the only thing that there isn't really a clear example of. Some would argue that because he had bipolar disorder, maybe he was dissociating during his murders and things like that. I don't think you can argue that, because he was found sane at the time of his murders. He knew what he was doing. That's kind of what they mean by dissociation. So this model definitely paints a very clear picture of how he got to this point. And I would like to point something out. This is in no way defending him or justifying his behavior, but it does go along with processing trauma. And I think just the main point I'm trying to make is that he wasn't able to process his trauma, and that led to his demons, his inner demons kind of coming out, basically, is what I'm trying to say. So Cary's first and maybe biggest, his most direct traumatic event was being molested by his uncle. He was the victim of a horrible, disgusting crime at the hands of someone he trusted. But before he could even begin to process this trauma and process himself being a victim, his brother went missing and became a victim. So Cary was no longer a victim. It was about his brother now. So he didn't even have a second to process anything that happened. The trauma that he dealt with and his victimization were no longer of concern, and it was literally put on the back burner, and he was to not even think about it. Someone else was the victim. In turn, he became the victimizer. And disclaimer, majority of those who are abused and molested as a child do not grow up to mirror the same behavior. They do not become child molesters. Rarely ever happens. At the same time, the majority of violent offenders did undergo some sort of violent trauma as children. But I just wanted to point that out, that that's probably a very big reason as to why he became the victimizer, is because he himself did not get a chance to process the fact that he was a victim. And one of the most important clues linking these murders was the manner in which the victims died. I just want to point that out real quickly. So Hickey talks about decapitation, and he says that decapitation, or nearly severing a person's head, is not just about murder, but is also about sexual fantasy and gratification. The offender becomes sexually gratified by the fantasy of cutting into a victim's throat. The sense of sexual power overwhelms the offender. Stayner had been fantasizing and drawing his fantasies of decapitation for several years. The method of killing became his sexual signature that could link him to other similar murders. While awaiting trial at the Fresno County Jail, Stayner enjoyed drawing pictures on the walls of his cell of decapitated heads of females. He also tried and failed to sell autographed photos of himself to the public. That kind of, to me, brings out the importance of profiling. His fantasies and his drawings literally became his realities, and just that one little part of his crimes, the decapitation, was used to try and link him to other crimes. Obviously, we don't know if he was the one who committed that one murder of that woman, but it just shows you that in other cases, these things are so important.
That was wild.
So wild. And it leaves a lot of people questioning, like, is this Kenneth Parnell's fault that Cary Stayner turned into a serial killer.
I feel like he was going to commit crimes anyway, but they might not have been so severe if that didn't happen to him, because I feel like a lot of mental illnesses like his are triggered by something. And I think that could have been a huge trigger for him.
100%. And, obviously if Stephen never went missing, I don't think the kids would have been neglected. So maybe he could have gotten help and he would have understood his victimization. But at the same time, his family was so weird with emotion, and his family was also filled with pedophiles. So it doesn't surprise me that they were hiding, they wanted to hide emotions, because they were hiding a lot of things. But I don't know. This case just makes me think. I am a huge nerd about nature, nurture, this, and this leads you to this. That's literally why I went to school for what I did. Not that I'm doing anything with it now, but yeah. So I just thought this case was crazy, and I hope you guys not enjoyed it, because it was horrible, it was heartbreaking, it was disgusting, but
terrible.
The episode.
I thought this was crazy.
I really want to. I didn't watch the documentary. I read the book, so it was a book first. I Know My Name is Stephen. I read the book. That's where I got a lot of the information from this. Sources will be cited, but I want to watch the movie.
I do too. What's it called again?
I Know My Name is Stephen.
I'm going to find it. And I'm going to watch it tomorrow while Max is not home, because I can't watch those things while he's home.
He is scary.
He is a scary. I'm currently watching The Assassination of Gianni Versace, and I cannot watch while he is home. Fantastic show, so everybody should watch that.
I know. I've been meaning to watch that for so long.
Oh, Darren Cross plays a wonderful psychotic maniac.
Oh, I love him.
Me too. He'd be nothing without Glee.
I would be nothing without Glee.
I truly would be nothing without Glee. Well, thank you guys so much for listening. And if you haven't already, please subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. Leave a review if you are feeling extra nice. It always helps. And you can follow us on all social medias. It's just at Crime on Caffeine on Twitter, on Facebook, on Instagram.
Thank you guys so much for your support. Thank you for sharing our show with everyone you know. Keep on sharing. If you guys do want some stickers,
Yes, DM us if you want stickers.
Shout us out on Insta and we will send one your way.
And we did it, guys. We hit 4,000 downloads.
Yes, thank you so much.
So we're just so excited.
Keep listening. We're going to keep making episodes for you guys every Wednesday. Remember, if you do have any suggestions for cases or coffee.
All right. Well, we will catch you next week. Bye.